Paul Cézanne's studios provided not only secluded and Spartan working spaces for the solitary Provençal painter, but indispensable laboratories across a range of subjects and media in his work. Still life painting, the quintessential realist subject of artists' ateliers, assumed a primal place in Cézanne's early oeuvre and retained a formative role in his later work as well. Still life had long occupied the lowest rung on the hierarchical ladder of genres, and because it was typically marked by naturalist depictions of inanimate, and in Cézanne's case, rather commonplace objects, it could seem devoid of expressive or creative impulse. In his hands, however, as you know well, still life painting would become another genre entirely and ripe for modernist invention. His preeminence as a painter of still life is a prime reason why one such canvas by Cézanne figures at the center of Maurice Denis' Homage de Cézanne of 1900, rather than a likeness of him as was more common in group portraits painted as tributes to a master. And we're looking here at Fantin-Latour's 1864 tribute to Delacroix, which became a model for this kind of 19th century honorific image. Cézanne's still life with Compotier of about 1879 to 1880, a painting once owned by Paul Gauguin, is pictured in Denis' painting on an easel in Ambroise Volard's gallery, and in the midst of a circle of mostly symbolist artists, many of them members of the secret société of the Nabai. Gauguin had been a crucial mentor for the group in the late 1880s, and like him, they emphasized symbolist and expressive metaphor in their art, rather than the painting of observed nature. An impressionist portrait by Renoir of a woman in a red hat appears at right on the back wall of Volard's gallery, and next to it, a Tahitian figural scene by Gauguin, and you can just glimpse them there in the back. In the foreground, the young red-haired Paul Seruzier, an acolyte of Gauguin and a founding member of the Nabai, addresses with visible enthusiasm the older symbolist painter Odilon Redon. Redon stands at left pose like the elder statesman of the group and ponders intently what the younger artist says. The standard reading of Denis' painting assumes that its author wanted to chart here the gradual turning away from Impressionism and the more subjective realm of Gauguin and symbolism to the reassertion of the classical values Denis admired in Cézanne's painting. To judge from Denis' critical writings on Cézanne, this may, in part, be true. But I think what Denis is really proposing here in placing the matter-of-fact genre of still life in the midst of a circle of symbolists is the crucial role that still life will have in the avant-garde art of the future, where the boundaries that separate the meta-pictorial art of the studio and the fantastic realm of painters' imaginations will ultimately disappear. The fluidities of the genres in Cézanne's art has long been noted and has become a renewed focus in recent criticism and in a few recent intriguing exhibitions. This has led contemporary scholars to cast his intimate, unassuming naturemorts as key players in a larger dialectic. We know, for example, that Cézanne took great pains in his studio when composing his still life motifs, slipping coins under fruits or plates to give them an uneasy, tilted stance, folding and refolding table linens and arranging floral tapestries to underscore the major thrusts and colors of his compositions, editing the palette of his studio wallpapers to fit the design of his still lifes, and even using paper flowers instead of real ones so they would last and he could bend them to his liking. The controlled conditions of the studio and the capacity of still life to isolate within it purely formal issues would make the genre crucial for countless early modernists, but for Cézanne, it seemed to offer far more. As seen in the 2014 Cézanne show at the Thyssen-Bornemisza in Madrid, Many of his still lifes prompt direct association with landscape. This is suggested in this familiar comparison between a still life of 1879 at MoMA and a later landscape that is now on view at the Hermitage. The starched and peaked white napkin perched on Cézanne's studio table at left seems to rehearse the familiar profile and tilted tabletop-like environs captured in his view of Mont Saint-Victoire of 1895, as pictured at right. Similarly, as put forth on another wall in Madrid, where the two works now on the screen were juxtaposed, Cézanne's large and magnificent still life with flowers of 1890 seems to anticipate his late Mont Saint-Victoire on the right. One could certainly argue, as did the show's curator, that the billowing flowers that hover over the studio table and the expansive swells of fabric in the earlier still life are reversed and transposed by the painter in his later Provençal landscape. Conversely, in other paintings, as beautifully demonstrated in Carol Armstrong's recent exhibition of Cézanne still lifes at the Getty, and as echoed in Alex Eiling's 2017 show in Karlsruhe entitled Cézanne Metamorphoses, the everyday objects the artist collected and composed in his studio could be recreated to dazzling effect in later still lifes that take on an expansive and strangely topographical aura, reminiscent of the earlier landscapes. In a sense, then, Cézanne's humble still life objects could be recast as protagonists in mute dramas he staged in his studio. The surrealist painter and poet André Masson recognized early on this occasional but striking reciprocity between still life and landscape in Cézanne's art, when he advised that in trying to grasp Cézanne's pictorial genius, which is never an easy task, one should, quote, look at those still lifes that follow the advice of Saint-Victoire, for they are, in fact, geological. Cézanne's late still life with Teapot on the right, for example, seems to bear the imprint of a view of Mont Saint-Victoire painted about a decade before. The flattened profile of the mountain presented when viewed from the south in the direction of the village of Gardin, as seen in the painting on the left, and the zigzag diagonals of the hilly intervening terrain that lead to its distant rounded plateau are recalled in the later still life. A visual memory in his studio of a formal motif he had observed and painted firsthand in nature, the still life seems to not only reiterate, but to fortify the landscape's defining compositional lines and to augment its distinctly Provençal palette. As Eiling argued, the pronounced architectonic composition of the still life may have given it a second life in Cézanne's work as scaffolding for a later landscape. There are many other such reciprocities in his work, and we are looking at the Met still life with apples from the late 70s, and next to it, the Orsay's late watercolor of Mont Saint-Victoire, in which the mountain's pale, familiar profile seems strikingly akin to that of the bunched fabric on a table painted decades before. Such analogies allow us far more than a window into the painter's reconfigurations of the genres. If the controlled logic of his studio practice and the calculated formal disposition he imposed there upon everyday objects could inform the spatial ordering and harmonious structure he sought in his landscapes, the reverse could be true as well. More than merging or conflating disparate genres, Cézanne was concerned with formal affinities across such categorical boundaries that both transformed his subjects and tied them together. Imbuing landscape with a sense of harmonious rational order that nature rarely proffered, and giving still life a sense of the immensity and magnificence of a world he encountered in nature and then sought to capture, reorder, and contain in the studio. As Richard Schiff has shown, many of Cézanne's still life paintings are powerful conflations of optical perception and physical touch, and they constrain to become overt interior landscapes, exhibiting not so much a slippage between genres as the metaphoric tensions that separate them. In my remarks tonight, with such recent reconsiderations of Cézanne's genre-bending paintings as prologue, I would like to look at a small handful of fantastic paintings in his work that have been described as exceptional or ecstatic or even hallucinatory paintings, because I think they argue for yet another dimension for his still lifes. As seen in related works from which they evolve, these wildly imaginative paintings and watercolors allowed the artist to revisit the charged figural subjects and impassioned form of his early work, and to transform them in still lifes created in his studio. Beautiful and compelling on their own, they also reveal Cézanne taking stock of crucial artistic influences whose significance for his painting changed substantially over the course of his career. We see him mapping that critical evolution in his art. At times, such still lifes can also be, strangely and surprisingly, sensual. But rather than extending the late Meyer Shapiro's arguments for what he termed a latent erotic sense or an unconscious symbolizing of repressed desire that he felt underpinned some of Cézanne's still lifes, especially his paintings of apples, and rather than exploring Sidney Geist's conception of still life as an explicitly sensual or even sexual terrain, and I must mention Sidney Geist when I speak at the studio school, I hope to reframe discussion of the genre in Cézanne's art to include these lyrical and critically neglected outliers. They lead us into a rapturous, fantastic realm rarely associated with the artist's still lifes and studio practice. And they underscore the ineffable creative forces that draw together the whole of Cézanne's achievement. And they place the process of perception and the role of visual memory on unexpectedly equal footing. And finally, Cézanne's fantastic still lifes are what we would most wish for in late-stage painting from a master, in that they both affirm and surprise. The elasticity of all the genres in Cézanne's art is evident from the very outset of his career, when the young artist first discovered in mostly figural paintings and sculptures in the Louvre the dynamic, volumetric forms and generative rhythms that would find reflection in his own work in every conceivable category. This can be seen, for example, in his incessant drawings after Rubens' Marie de Medici cycle, and especially after the three naiads in the Flemish painter's scene of the Queen's disembarkation at Marseille. We see a sketchbook page on the right of those. Cézanne's studies after Rubens' cycle date back to the 1860s, his first decade in Paris. They would span nearly 30 years of drawings in his sketchbooks and would shape in myriad ways the artist's own painted narratives and nudes. This is a detail of the Rubens there on the right. His images in this figural genre are marked by their utter rejection of contemporaneity and impressionist painting, and by a thorough embrace of the art of the past that was tempered with a primitivist impulse Denis would struggle to explain. Such canvases as his Three Bathers on the right, for example, and other vaguely mythological early paintings are built around the swirling energies and organic unity Cézanne first perceived in Rubens' Medici cycle in the Louvre. The formative lessons of Rubens' Medici paintings, however, extended far beyond Cézanne's figural canons and compositions, and contribute to the extraordinary fluid boundaries between the genres in his art. It is almost impossible, for example, to discuss such exquisite works as Cézanne's late watercolor on the left, still life, apples, pears, and pot, or a kitchen table, and to account for its unabated physical and displaced sensual ambiance without reference to his earlier studies in the Louvre after Rubens' aquatic nymphs. In the more ephemeral and private mediums of works on paper, which were never intended for public consumption, Cezanne seems to have felt freer to break through and blur the boundaries of the genres than he typically was in his oil paintings. As seen here in the watercolor of 1900 to 1904, his still life is stretched across his studio table at eye level in a shallow, continuous composition that echoes the frieze-like format he had quoted decades before from Rubens' Medici cycle. And its quotidian kitchen objects and luscious ripened fruit, which are marked by a raiment of brilliant modulated color and rapid repeated outlines, manifest the animated curves he had discovered in the Flemish painter's voluptuous nudes. In Rubens' painting, as quoted in Cezanne's early study, the swelling silhouettes of his nudes' rounded forms are offset by opposing diagonals at center, as seen in the outstretched arms of his sketch figures, which form a decisive V. In Cezanne's corresponding late kitchen still life, the extended diagonals of the culinary pot handle and at right the stem of the pear take on the same formal role, where they too frame and fortify by contrast the composition's opposing contours. Such luminous late still lifes visibly palpitate with the life and even the sensuality of Cezanne's figural studies, and have engendered spirited responses and even a poetic tradition of their own, to no one's surprise. The poet Rainer Marie Rilke would use an explicit carnal vocabulary to capture their inexplicable but overtly sensual character, while the more prim English critic Roger Fry would struggle to fit them uneasily into the chronology and theoretical structure he built for the artist. Most recently, in the catalog to her Cezanne still life show at the Getty, Carmel Armstrong memorably described the, quote, blood-ripened buttock-like fruit and the, quote, preposterously phallic handle of the pot as so exaggeratedly corporeal that this kitchen table is not a table at all. However, such studies from the Louvre and watercolors from his studio are not so much end products, or not only end products in themselves, but transitive, as they would serve as final rehearsals for the bathers' pictures, such as this one now on the right, that were soon to follow. Though adopting a vertical format now and oriented in reverse fashion, the rhythmic flow of repeated curving contours in Cezanne's visionary painting of female nudes of 1904 to 06 is offset by the violet-blue diagonal of the tree, itself recalled and transposed from his still life in watercolor, and ultimately from his sketches after Rubens. By tracing the inception, evolution, and later recurrence of this insistent and evocative formal motif in his art, we get a sense of just how crucial his suspension of the genre's boundaries was to Cezanne's insatiable quest for empowered pictorial form, and to the unity of his art as a whole. A more concentrated and cohesive example of Cezanne's analogous approach is evident in his painting of the orgy, or the banquet, of about 1867, and in its illustrious progeny, which includes, not surprisingly, several still lifes. Though relatively modest in scale, it measures about 2.5 by 4 feet. The canvas is hugely ambitious in its imagery and effects, and it just strikes me that I blew it up huge and shrunk Veronese. It kind of goes the other way, but try to imagine that. Cezanne's boisterous scene of drunken revelry resonates with the erotic exuberance of his early figural works and exhibits both the strident, impassioned style of his first decade of painting and the glowing luminosity of the works to come. It was conceived as an elaborate encomium to Paolo Veronese's monumental wedding feast at Cana of 1562 to 63 in the Louvre, which depicts a sumptuous New Testament scene with only the faintest of biblical overtones. Undertones, actually. This festive subject, recently studied by the German scholar Bertram Schmidt, and further explored at the moment by Cynthia Saltzman, had long proved a pretext for a profusion of still life motifs. Its appeal for the young Provençal painter was obvious. As with his conception of a vocabulary of landscape formulated from objects in his studio, Cezanne would see here a similar congruence. Both figures and still life objects, exotic servants and lavishly costumed revelers, elaborate wine and water vessels are strewn across Veronese's shallow stage-like space. They would figure prominently in the work of his 19th century adherents, including Thomas Couture, who in his Romans of the Decadence and other works would take up more secular bacchanalian themes. For his painting of the orgy, Cezanne also drew on such literary sources as Flaubert's description of a raucous feast in his Temptation of St. Anthony, and he likewise summoned, as the artist would tell his later biographer, Joachim Gasquet, the lavish banquet Honoré de Balzac detailed in Le Peau de Chagrin, a passage inspired by Veronese's Cana. Cezanne's painting represented, in effect, a kind of parodic literary strain that he would largely shun in the following decades. Nevertheless, the orgy would remain in the artist's possession until his death, and its flamboyant imagery and sensate effects, as well as Veronese's place in the process of its imagining, clearly lingered in Cezanne's pictorial consciousness. The painter Eugène Delacroix may also have had a hand in the orgy's formulation, as suggested in the sketchbook page that includes scribbled studies for the painting that proliferate under the watchful eye of a portrait of the romantic artist above. The verso of the page holds studies by Cezanne after Veronese's Cana. Casting its ample shadow before it, Cezanne's early painting of the orgy is recalled decades later in his Preparation for a Banquet, a canvas of about 1888 to 1890 that reflects the earlier work's charge, festive tenor, and vocabulary, if not its narrative theme and insistent gaucherie. Much in the later painting looks familiar. Tall, bronzed male nudes once more carry amphoras to a sumptuous table laden with terrines and exotic fruit. An outsized golden ewer, or Baroque beaker, as Schmidt told me, rises upward at the table's center, while overscaled vessels float ambiguously in the foreground. Veronese's celebrated painting visibly lingers in the air as well. A third figure in the preparation, cut off by the canvas's lower edge, faces the viewer at center. And where's this? I'm talking about this figure here. Though only roughly delineated with rounded repetitive strokes and broken touches of paint, he appears to bend from the waist as if, as one scholar has written, he is bowing to an imaginary public. The figure derives, however, not from the orgy, but I think from a study Cezanne had done decades before of a servant in a similar position and similar pose and foreground position in Veronese's feast, where he is shown decanting wine into a wide-mouthed receptacle. Cezanne's sketchbook drawing of the subject, dated to 1867, was one of several he executed as his obsession with Veronese's painting grew, and as his own first painting derived from it took shape. And this is a detail of that painting here. Though unused in the earlier orgy composition, the recollected figure takes its place in the later canvas, offering a telling formal link to its storied past. In effect, the artist seems to look here through the lens of his own work at the history of its evolving and transformative engagement with Veronese's seminal feast. And it is this metamorphic narrative and its extended colloquy with his own painting's past, rather than a more literary or legible subject, that draws us to the later work. As late as 1906, the year of Cezanne's death, the enduring presence of the Venetian painting in his pictorial imagination and visual memory would be summoned by the aged artist in conversation with his disciple, who we have already met tonight, Maurice Denis. In its structured format, if not its exotic imagery and style, Cezanne's Preparation for a Banquet can also be situated in larger contexts within the artist's oeuvre. Organized by a tent-like pyramid at center, its composition echoes that of Cézanne's fantastic paintings from the 1870s, in which that felicitous and rigidly constrolling format was first essayed. I think I skipped a work here. The triangular framework and flesh-tone palette of his first modern Olympia, which you see on the left, and even the bright red fruit and exotic servant in the background, for example, anticipate the theatrical composition and imagery of his later banquet. Likewise, the format of the preparation finds echoes in the crowning canopy that had enshrined the ferocious sexuality of his ironic subject in the early Eternal Féminin, and again, in the diamond-shaped sheet that serves as a backdrop to the brazenly provocative nude in his Temptation of St. Anthony. The studied effect of the later preparation for a banquet, however, is fundamentally different from that of the earlier works in its rejection of narrative, its emphasis on still life, and in terms of its technique. The artist's exquisite interplay of nervous calligraphic lines and sketch-like strokes of pigment across the painting's open, flattened surface give it a pulsating vitality and a sensual immediacy that cannot be camouflaged by a literary subject and need not constrain, as did the controlling formats and emphatic labored brushwork of his canvases from the 1870s, the force of its subject. Even the immense pendant swan who figures, albeit strangely, in the triangular central shelter of his preparation sheds any hint of a mythological charge, something the artist pursued elsewhere in his various depictions of Leda and the Swan. Cézanne's preparation for a banquet, an animated and self-reflexive exploratory exercise that focuses our attention on the fluid means and process of its construction, stages its theme of open sensual abundance, both visual and gustatory, with painterly and celebratory aplomb. The fantastic dreamlike realm of the orgy and preparations, which blur the boundaries of their respective genres, extend to still life itself in Cézanne's Nature Morte or Table du Banquet, a canvas that you see here on the right, that Marie Denis would come to own. Though usually dated to 1888 to 1890, some scholars have placed it later, slightly later, in the artist's chronology. Built up of shimmering veils of scintillating color and gestural strokes of paint, the precious objects depicted in the painting are fully dematerialized. A related preparatory drawing that you see on the left, marked by quivering penciled contours and a pulsing web of transparent color touches, pushes its subject almost to abstraction. In both its lustrous opulence and baffling intangible imagery, the painting stands in utter contrast to the more typical, densely realized and classic still lifes of the period, such as Cézanne's The Kitchen Table of exactly the same date, where a crowded corner of his studio at home is filled with tactile quotidian objects and recognizable tools of his craft. Cézanne's far more fantastic Nature Morte depicts a lavish still life array like that found in the preparation for a banquet. It addresses as well a tradition of such subjects in interiors that was emblematic of luxury and sensual excess, as typified in the extravagant pronkstillavens of the Dutch painter Jean-David de Heem, rendered not so much as straightforward records of visual truths, but more obliquely as theatrical spectacles of sensual seduction. Such paintings were intricately staged productions in which the symbolic vanitas meanings traditionally associated with the still life genre could become secondary or even subsumed into the sensate pleasures implied by their palatial splendor. As recently suggested by Brigitte Alsdorf, Cézanne may have borrowed a repertoire of his own stock motifs from de Heem's A Table of Desserts that you see on the left, a painting of 1640 that he knew in the Louvre. The cascading tablecloths, tilted fruit-like plates, and small objects placed in precarious positions that fill Cézanne's more typical still life paintings, for example, suggest that he knew de Heem's work well. The Dutch painter's canvas would also appeal to Henri Matisse, who produced both a small-scale direct copy in 1893 and a monumental adapted version painted in 1915 that you see on the right. Though Matisse employed in the later painting his new Cubist-inspired methods of modern construction, as he described them, that would rigidly order many of his wartime works, his natural tendency towards coloristic and painterly seduction, and perhaps the subject itself, mitigated here its controlling programmatic structure. In his own Nature Morte, Cézanne more closely approached and thus must have also grasped the essence of de Heem's extravagant still lifes as paeans to luxury and pleasure. Though vastly smaller in scale than de Heem's majestic painting and lacking the Dutch artist's signature emblems of worldly sophistication, Cézanne's fantastic still life represents a similar passage away from an established naturalist genre based on direct perception of a motif to one that celebrates an overt and luxuriant sensuality, though now distinctly one of his own imaginative making. The loose liquid brushwork of Cézanne's Nature Morte clearly builds on the diaphanous watercolor that preceded it, transforming the airy touches of color and agitated graphic markings of the preparatory work into a fully fledged, richly Baroque painting that is marked by its dense textural unity. The painting's tremulous forms and surface, as well as its elusive format, reinforce its overtly fantastic aura. The canvas pictures a snow-white diagonal banquet that teems with familiar festive objects and terminates in a pair of pendant swans, offering in its format a formal analogy to the painter's provocative early mythologies. Behind, a hanging patterned textile spills into a cloth-covered table, and next to it a flattened grid of framed and painted panels suggests the crowded walls of an artist's studio. Finally, at far right in Cézanne's painting, though not in the watercolor, a partially nude male figure crouches under the weight of his heavy load, recalling the burdened servants of the earlier banquet picture. The painting may be a fanciful rendering of an imagined sculpture, or a fragment of an earlier remembered painting, or perhaps a resonant emblem of the work's origins in the earlier exotic feasts, but it summons a conception of an artist's studio that bears little resemblance to those we associate with Cézanne. The figure's incongruous scale and placement in the painting's packed, unreadable space anticipate the deliberate artifice of what is arguably Cézanne's most ambitious still life and most complex painting about his studio practice, the still life with plaster cast of about 1895 on the left. But the elusive subject and dreamlike aura of his Nature Morte, conveyed in its imagery as well as in its style, hark back to a smaller, imaginative, and starkly different realm in his art. In his Cézanne Metamorphosis show, Eiling delved deeply into the realm in the painter's work where the reciprocities between the genres reveal most fully the extent of his subversive approach to the hierarchies and legacies of the past, even as Cézanne enshrines some of his greatest forebears in his own work. That path leads, not surprisingly, to the art of Delacroix, another rebel whom Cézanne would count as a prime artistic forebearer, and especially to Delacroix's massive history painting of the death of Sardanapalus of 1827, itself aptly once described as a monumental still life. The canvas, a staggering depiction of the moment the besieged monarch commands that his royal household be put to the sword and his palace treasures burned rather than ceded to invading rebel forces, would captivate the Provençal painter throughout his career and in ways that have gone as yet unstudied. Rarely exhibited in Cézanne's lifetime, though we know it well today, the incendiary painting, an opulent icon of its epic's cult of exoticism and of romantic decadence and excess as a whole, was Delacroix's only early history painting not to be purchased by the state. It would remain in private hands until it entered the Louvre amid much controversy in 1921. Cézanne probably knew it best, or perhaps only, from black and white reproductions, one of which hung on the wall of his final studio in Aix at Les Louvres, and we see a photograph of it there. I'm skipping ahead. The effect of Delacroix's Sardanapalus on Cézanne was so powerful that the Provençal painter could only digest the colossal set piece one bite at a time. In this small page from one of his early sketchbooks, here on the right, Cézanne captures the dissolute monarch in a rough graphite and crayon drawing. It may have been a preparation for a later work of his own. As has often been pointed out, the reclining figure of the dissolute Assyrian king in Delacroix's canvas is recollected in Cézanne's own self-portrait in a recumbent pose in his early Pastoral, or Idyll, a painting of about 1870, in which he, like Delacroix's protagonist, lies frozen and dispassionate, as if inured to the dark, dreamlike vision of female nudes who surround him. Much like Veronese's wedding feast at Cana, Delacroix's Sardanapalus gave pride of place to still life. The luxurious ensemble at left, and we see the details surrounding the work here, the ensemble at left of a silver beaker and its accompanying filigreed cup on a tray are emblematic of the despot's riches, while the piles of chattel strewn with broken and discarded jewels at right and below evoke the chaos and violence of his rule. Delacroix's anomalous composition, where a stage-like frontal plane filled with giant roiling figures is pitted against the painting's deeply receded background, confounded his critics and confused his viewers, but it was crucial to the painting's intended shocking reception. The savage carnal energies that sweep across its surface in the foreground become all the more potent and unsettling when framed by the yawning chasm stretching into the background that is occupied by the submissive and scaled-down king. Cézanne once confided to Gasquet that an artist should compose his landscapes as if they were history paintings, and he seems to have extended that analogy to his still lifes as well. He would unpack the visual effects of the deep diagonal orientation of Delacroix's Sardanapalus in a number of complex still lifes that challenged the significance of Delacroix's history painting and of its heroic genre in general. He would also explore its fragile emotional effects in figural sketches and watercolors that reenact the dramatic scene in terms of his own evolving imagery and style. Finally, in what is probably one of his very last still life paintings and likely executed at Les Louvres in the presence of his photograph of Delacroix's Sardanapalus, Cézanne merged the fluid realms of the studio with that of his fervid imagination and visual memory in a final still life that defies any categorization whatsoever. But to get started, in the buffet of 1877 to 79, Cézanne composes his still life as if it were a history painting. Like compartmentalized vignettes in an ascending landscape, the sideboard step surfaces are organized into separate and discrete motifs that are tied together by the vertical fall of drapery, corresponding colors and forms. In the foreground, still life objects stretch across the buffet's surface and are opposed by the conspicuous diagonal at right that reaches, uncharacteristically for Cézanne, but analogous to that found in the Sardanapalus canvas, to the very upper edge of his painting. Eiling sees a direct correlation between that undulating silhouette in the still life and the corresponding diagonal in Delacroix's composition, or the wildly gesturing figure at far right and the nude male figures above him that draw us back and deeply into his theatrical scene. It is hard not to see such earlier imaginative works on paper as this page of Private Studies from the mid-1870s as intermediary sketches that stand between the Sardanapalus painting and Cézanne's increasingly complex later still lifes. The latter seem to build upon the painting's theatrical format, employing a corresponding diagonal and propelled by similarly theatrical figures. In the sketch, Cezanne himself peers out at top right. You can see him here. Looking around the corner to see what's going on. Likewise, in such subsequent watercolor sketches as this one, and there are others that we could point to as well, this is a late addition to his series on the eternal féminin, Cézanne's female nude stretches back as her admirers are compelled to follow her into a deep diagonal space that in itself offers an ironic commentary on the inescapable allure of its sexualized subject. But it is in his late, complex, and incredibly dynamic still lifes, in which spilling fruit and cascading fabric tumbling into abyss offer ever more impossible visual dramas that defy the reality of space and of the studio itself, the dramatic lessons of Delacroix and of history painting as a whole are at once applied and brilliantly overturned. How else can one approach or explain the unprecedented force and ineffable grandeur of a studio painting such as Cézanne's still life with floral tapestry and fruit that dates to the very close of his career and was likely painted at Les Louvres? There is no question that Cézanne came of age as an artist when the long-established hierarchies, institutions, and traditions that had governed the art world for generations were being transformed and upended by artists of every conceivable aesthetic stripe. Many would likewise chart a transgressive path in their art that plumbed the depths and revealed the insufficiencies of each of the prevailing genres and of every other institutional facet in the field. But what Cézanne did with the legacy of the past, and what he did with still life in particular, is unique and crucial to understanding the whole of his achievement. The still lifes that stem from the narrow tradition of festive and exotic imagery in Cézanne's work address neither the tensions between the facts of his medium and those of the objects he depicted, nor his perception of what still life could become in the art of his followers. They chart instead an underlying unity in his oeuvre made possible by the relentless force and indefatigable inventiveness of the artist's pictorial imagination and prolific visual memory. His visionary naturemorts, though few in number, are threaded through his career and allowed Cézanne to capture, preserve, and immortalize the frisson and emotional force of his earlier works and those of his forebearers in the most prolific genre of his later years. By then, he had become the acknowledged modern master of still life painting. And one privilege of mastery is the right to push one's own boundaries. We have come to equate Cézanne's studio and his practice there with the control, formal, and metaphorical logic long attributed to his still life painting. But the works examined here, and a scattering of other inexplicably imaginative works, suggest that his hermetic working spaces also facilitated fantastic ruminative musings and nostalgic looks back at the formative paths and memories they charted across the genre in his oeuvre that are crucial to comprehending the full measure of his genius, something we still struggle to grasp in its entirety today. Thank you.